He was illiterate, a simple peasant who walked through the frozen, unforgiving streets of Siberia with dirt caked on his worn clothes and bare feet wrapped in nothing more than tattered rags. His appearance was that of a vagrant, a nobody, someone whom polite society would instinctively avoid and dismiss without a second thought. Yet within a remarkably few short years, this seemingly unremarkable man, this uneducated wanderer from the most remote corners of the Russian Empire, would ascend to a position of such extraordinary power that it would defy all logic and social convention. He would come to determine the course of the Russian imperial court, wielding influence over ministers, generals, and emperors themselves, and even altering the trajectory of the First World War in ways that would reverberate across continents and through generations. How did such an unsophisticated individual, lacking formal education, political connections, or aristocratic lineage, manage to infiltrate the innermost circles of power within an empire that was simultaneously the largest territorial domain on Earth and an institution teetering precariously on the brink of total collapse? What combination of charisma, cunning, genuine spiritual gifts, or pure historical accident allowed this Siberian peasant to become one of the most powerful figures in one of the world's great empires? And perhaps most intriguingly, why does his name continue to evoke such powerful emotions, fear, fascination, revulsion, and endless conspiracy theories, more than a century after his violent death in the frozen waters of the Neva River? In this comprehensive and meticulously researched exploration, you will immerse yourself deeply in the authentic, documented life of Grigori Rasputin, the mystic who bewitched and ultimately helped destroy Russia's last imperial family, becoming a pivotal figure during one of the most turbulent, consequential periods in modern history. We will methodically and carefully separate the accumulated myths from documented historical reality, reveal little-known details about his extraordinary journey from obscurity to infamy, provide context for the social and political forces that enabled his rise, and analyze with clarity why Rasputin remains so profoundly relevant in contemporary discussions about psychological manipulation, blind faith, the corruption of power, and the exercise of influence from the shadows of official authority. Have you ever felt manipulated by someone who appeared utterly harmless, even benevolent, on the surface? Have you wondered how far a truly charismatic figure can go in influencing critical decisions that ultimately change the destinies of millions of people, altering the course of history itself? Have you observed leaders, spiritual figures, or influencers who seem to possess an inexplicable hold over their followers, making rational people behave in seemingly irrational ways? If these questions resonate with your own experiences or observations of the world around you, then this narrative is precisely what you need to understand one of history's most compelling examples of charismatic authority run amok. Prepare yourself for an intellectual and emotional journey into the heart of power, faith, and manipulation, because Rasputin's story is not merely about the distant past, it speaks directly, urgently, and disturbingly to the dangers we face in our present world, where similar figures continue to emerge and exploit the vulnerabilities of individuals and institutions alike. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 21, 1869, in the small to profoundly isolated village of Pokrovskoye, located in the Tobolsk region of western Siberia, then an integral part of the vast Russian Empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. This was a land characterized by extreme geographic isolation from the centers of Russian culture and power, by brutal winters that could last for 6 months or more, with temperatures plummeting to life-threatening levels, and by a subsistence economy based almost entirely on rudimentary agriculture, fishing in the nearby rivers, and the breeding of livestock that somehow survived the harsh climate. Life in Pokrovskoye was hard, unforgiving, and offered little opportunity for advancement or escape from the grinding poverty that characterized peasant existence throughout rural Russia. His family belonged to the class of Orthodox Russian peasants, legally free but economically bound to the land, integrated into the Maya, a form of traditional rural commune that collectively managed the agricultural lands, distributed strips of fields to individual families, and shared responsibilities for taxes and obligations to the state and church. His father, Yefim Yakovlevich Rasputin, performed various functions related to local administration within this communal system, serving as a messenger who carried official communications between villages, a guardian of the communal pastures where livestock grazed, and occasionally as a cart driver, transporting goods to nearby towns. These roles granted him a certain degree of social prestige within the small insular community of Pokrovskoye, marking the family as slightly above the poorest peasants, though they possessed no real wealth and lived in conditions that would shock modern observers. A simple wooden house with minimal furniture, sleeping on stoves for warmth during winter, and eating a monotonous diet of bread, cabbage, and occasionally fish or meat. During his childhood years, young Grigori had virtually no access to formal education of any meaningful kind. The parish school in the village was extremely precarious and poorly funded, lacking proper educational materials, staffed by an overworked and underqualified teacher, and operating only sporadically when weather and agricultural demands permitted children to attend. Historical records and biographical accounts suggest that Rasputin remained functionally illiterate until well into adulthood, never mastering the ability to read or write with any real proficiency or fluency. This lack of formal education, however, did not indicate a lack of intelligence or perceptiveness. On the contrary, Rasputin would later demonstrate remarkable intuitive understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the mechanics of influence and persuasion, skills that cannot be taught in classrooms but must be learned through keen observation and experience. The predominant religiosity in Pokrovskoye and throughout rural Siberia reflected the Russian Orthodox tradition, but in a form that was highly syncretic in nature, creatively blending official church teachings with ancient popular beliefs, folk superstitions that predated Christianity, and pre-Christian pagan customs that had survived for centuries despite the church's best efforts to eliminate them. Faith was transmitted primarily through oral tradition rather than through written texts, through endlessly repeated liturgies conducted in Old Church Slavonic that peasants could not fully understand, and through stories of saints, miracles, and divine intervention told by village elders around fires during the long winter nights when outdoor work was impossible. Icons were venerated not just as religious symbols, but as possessing actual power to heal, protect, and bring good fortune. Holy water, blessed bread, and relics of saints were treated as magical objects with tangible supernatural properties. Rasputin's personal spirituality appears to have emerged spontaneously during his youth, developing within this environment where mysticism, visions, and direct communication with the divine were viewed as legitimate and even admirable forms of religiosity rather than as signs of mental instability or heretical deviation. In certain regions of Siberia, particularly in areas distant from ecclesiastical oversight, practices such as extended fasting lasting weeks, arduous pilgrimages on foot to sacred sites hundreds of miles away, voluntary isolation in the wilderness, and self-mortification were relatively common among those seeking spiritual purification, divine visions, and closer communion with God. Young people who showed signs of a spiritual calling through visions, dreams, unusual sensitivity to religious matters, or simply an intense desire to dedicate themselves to faith, were often encouraged by their communities to pursue this path, sometimes being sent away to monasteries, to live with hermits in forest cells, or simply released from normal family and communal obligations to follow their spiritual destiny. Later testimonies collected by investigators and journalists from people who had known Rasputin in his village during his youth mention numerous episodes in which the young Grigori appeared to enter spontaneous trance-like states, spoke of mysterious visions involving the Virgin Mary and various saints, demonstrated what seemed like prophetic knowledge of future events, and showed an unusual, almost disturbing sensitivity toward religious themes and spiritual matters that set him distinctly apart from his peers. Some villagers recalled that he would sometimes wander off alone into the surrounding forests and fields, remaining absent for days at a time, returning in an altered psychological state and speaking of encounters with divine presences. Others remembered that he possessed an uncanny ability to calm frightened animals, particularly horses, which in peasant communities was often interpreted as a sign of supernatural gifts or special divine favor. Already during his adolescent years, Rasputin exhibited significant difficulties in socializing normally with his peers and displayed impulsive, unpredictable behavior patterns that aroused distrust, suspicion, and even fear among some neighbors who found his intensity unsettling. There are fragmentary records suggesting involvement in petty theft, excessive drinking, a chronic problem throughout rural Russia, and possibly sexual impropriety, though the details are murky and may have been exaggerated by later hostile biographers. What is clear is that the young Rasputin was regarded as strange, troubling, someone who did not quite fit into the normal patterns of village life and social expectations. There are no concrete records documenting early participation in organized religious movements or formal spiritual training, but historians and researchers believe he had contact with the Old Believers, Starovary, a traditionalist branch of Russian Orthodoxy that had split from the main church in the 17th century over liturgical reforms and maintained stricter, more ascetic practices. He was also exposed to devotional practices typical of peasant religiosity throughout Siberia, such as the use of homemade icons crafted from wood and metal, household rituals performed to bless homes and protect against evil spirits, and faith-healing ceremonies conducted by local wise women and men who possessed knowledge of herbal remedies and spiritual techniques passed down through generations. At the beginning of the 1890s, following the tragic death of one of his young children from illness, a common occurrence in an era of high infant mortality but nonetheless devastating to the family, and experiencing a period of profound personal instability marked by reported alcoholism, marital difficulties, and a general sense of spiritual crisis, Rasputin made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. He embarked on a series of extensive pilgrimages to monasteries, sacred sites, and religious centers throughout the vast expanse of Russia, traveling primarily on foot across distances that would total thousands of miles over several years. This practice of religious pilgrimage was deeply embedded in Russian Orthodox culture, viewed as a means of spiritual purification, penance for sins, and seeking divine guidance through physical hardship, and exposure to sacred locations and holy men who had achieved spiritual enlightenment. One of his first documented stops was the Verkhoturye Monastery in the Ural Mountains region, a significant Orthodox religious center that housed the relics of Saint Simeon, which were believed to possess miraculous healing properties. Here, according to later accounts that Rasputin himself provided, he experienced a profound spiritual awakening that would fundamentally alter not just his religious views, but his entire conception of his purpose and destiny in life. Although he never formally entered monastic life by taking permanent vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a path that would have required him to permanently renounce his family and former identity, his extended contact with monks, wandering ascetics, and hermits living in forest cells deeply influenced his developing practices of prayer, fasting, introspection, and spiritual discipline. From these experienced spiritual practitioners, he absorbed techniques of meditation, methods of inducing altered states of consciousness through extended prayer and sleep deprivation, theological frameworks for understanding divine revelation, and perhaps most importantly, ways of projecting spiritual authority and commanding the attention and respect of others through force of personality and mystical charisma. During these pilgrimages, which extended over several years and took him from Siberia westward toward the heartland of European Russia and even eventually to Jerusalem, Rasputin drew closer to various non-Orthodox religious circles, including mystical groups, spiritual seekers, and dissident sects that existed on the margins of acceptable religious practice, tolerated but viewed with suspicion by church authorities. One such group was the Klisti, a secretive sect that allegedly practiced ritual self-flagellation as a means of spiritual purification, believed that Christ could be reincarnated in living individuals who achieved perfect spiritual purity, and reportedly engaged in ecstatic religious ceremonies that included frenzied dancing, speaking in tongues. And according to hostile sources, sexual rituals based on the theological principle that sin could be transcended through sinning itself, that one must descend into the depths of transgression to achieve true spiritual rebirth and purity. Though Rasputin never openly admitted involvement with the Klisti throughout his life, consistently denying any connection when questioned, his relationship with doctrines similar to theirs was repeatedly noted by opponents, investigated by church authorities, and became a central element in accusations of heresy leveled against him. The Orthodox Patriarchate itself seriously considered the possibility that he subscribed to heretical beliefs incompatible with church teaching, launching several investigations and collecting testimony from witnesses who claimed to have observed suspicious practices. However, conclusive documentary evidence was never formally presented in an ecclesiastical trial, leaving the question tantalizingly and frustratingly unresolved for historians. What can be said with certainty is that Rasputin's theology and spiritual practices contained elements that were unconventional, that his approach to sin, redemption, and the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms was complex and possibly heterodox, and that he absorbed influences from multiple sources during his years of wandering that would shape his later career as a spiritual advisor and healer. When Rasputin finally returned to Pokrovskoye, after years of wandering and spiritual seeking, appearing in his native village after a long absence, he had successfully constructed a reputation and persona as a transformed man, someone who had undergone a profound spiritual metamorphosis that set him apart from ordinary believers. He now possessed an ascetic appearance carefully cultivated to project holy authority, a long, unkempt beard that reached to his chest, simple peasant clothing that emphasized humility and rejection of worldly vanity, and most strikingly, a penetrating gaze that many who encountered him described as hypnotic, unsettling and capable of seeming to peer directly into one's soul. His behavior uniquely combined expressions of deep humility and self-abasement, with an intense spirituality and an air of prophetic authority that commanded attention and respect despite his lack of formal clerical status or education. He began attracting village neighbors and people from surrounding areas to prayer meetings held in his modest home, gatherings which, according to numerous witnesses who later provided testimony, included public confessions where participants revealed their sins and spiritual struggles. Passionate collective singing of religious hymns and folk spiritual songs, lengthy prayers sometimes lasting hours, and accounts of miraculous healings achieved through faith alone without medical intervention. Rasputin would lead these gatherings with considerable charisma, speaking in the simple but vivid language of peasant spirituality, using biblical parables and stories of saints to illustrate moral points, and often entering what appeared to be trance states during which he would deliver prophecies, spiritual insights, and personal messages that he claimed came directly from God or the Virgin Mary. These gatherings gradually grew in size, frequency, and intensity, drawing participants not just from Pokrovskoye, but from villages throughout the region as word spread about the holy man who had returned, transformed from his pilgrimages. Rasputin's spiritual prestige extended far beyond his small village, carried by networks of pilgrims, wandering beggars, and merchants who traveled between communities, spreading news and stories. Within a remarkably short time, people from other towns and even from nearby cities began making the journey to Pokrovskoye specifically to seek him out for relief from chronic illnesses that doctors could not cure, infertility that threatened family lines, possession by evil spirits, and various forms of personal anguish and spiritual distress. His name began circulating through informal networks of devotees and spiritual seekers throughout Western Siberia, gaining him a modest but growing regional fame as a healer of souls, a holy man, blessed with special gifts from God who could intercede with divine powers on behalf of suffering humanity. Rasputin's reputation was built not on theological sophistication or scholarly knowledge of scripture and doctrine, areas where his lack of education was obvious, but rather on his apparent ability to provide comfort, to project absolute confidence in the efficacy of faith and prayer, and perhaps most importantly, on seemingly successful cases of healing and prophecy that his followers attributed to his spiritual powers. Whether these successes were the result of genuine supernatural abilities, psychological suggestion, and the placebo effect, natural remission of illnesses, or simple coincidence is impossible to determine with certainty from the historical record. What matters is that they were believed to be miraculous by those who experienced them, and belief in Rasputin's powers became self-reinforcing as more people sought him out and interpreted their experiences through the lens of faith. Rasputin's momentous arrival in St. Petersburg, the magnificent imperial capital that was the political, cultural, intellectual and religious center of the Russian Empire, occurred around 1903 after years of pilgrimages and the considerable strengthening and geographical expansion of his reputation as a mystic and healer and holy man blessed with special divine gifts. At that particular historical moment, St. Petersburg was a city of striking contrasts: immense wealth alongside desperate poverty, Western European sophistication coexisting with Byzantine religious mysticism, progressive political movements challenging autocratic tradition. The city was marked by intense social tensions arising from industrialization, rapid social change, and the growing disconnect between the ruling classes and the increasingly restless population. There were also vigorous debates within educated circles about spiritual reforms, the need to reinvigorate Orthodox Christianity to address modern challenges, and anxiety about whether the old order could survive the forces of modernity that were transforming Russia. Rasputin was initially introduced to religious circles in the capital through the influential Bishop Theophan, who served as confessor to Tsarina Alexandra and held one of the most prestigious and powerful positions within the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy. Theophan was himself interested in spiritual renewal and was actively seeking authentic religious voices that could inspire genuine faith rather than mere formal observance of rituals. Impressed by Rasputin's personal charisma, his reputation for healing miracles that had preceded his arrival, and the numerous accounts of his spiritual gifts provided by others who had encountered him, Theophan made the significant decision to welcome him into his own residence, providing him with lodging, introductions, and, crucially, ecclesiastical legitimacy. This patronage facilitated Rasputin's entry into both ecclesiastical and aristocratic environments that would otherwise have been completely and permanently inaccessible to a Siberian peasant with no education, no social connections, and no formal position within any recognized institution. The Society of St. Petersburg during this period was experiencing an intense, almost desperate search for spiritual renewal and authentic religious experience, partly as a response to growing political crises that threatened the stability of the regime. The declining credibility and perceived spiritual bankruptcy of the official church, which was seen as bureaucratic and ritualistic rather than genuinely spiritual, and a broader cultural malaise affecting the educated classes who found traditional beliefs increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of modern scientific and philosophical challenges. The revolutionary events of 1905, which had shaken the empire with strikes, peasant uprisings, and even a naval mutiny, had left the ruling classes anxious and searching for sources of stability and meaning. In this atmosphere, eccentric figures with reputations as mystics, healers, and spiritual visionaries found considerable space and eager audiences among the nobility, who were actively searching for new meanings for their faith, new sources of spiritual authority to replace or supplement the failing official church, and perhaps reassurance that the old order could be spiritually renewed and saved from collapse. Rasputin stood out dramatically due to his unusual, almost shocking appearance. His simple peasant tunic worn in elegant aristocratic drawing rooms, his intense gaze that seemed to bore through social pretenses, his direct, informal manner of speaking that ignored the elaborate rules of etiquette governing noble society, and his thick Siberian accent and peasant vocabulary that contrasted utterly with the refined French-influenced speech of the elite. Rather than being a liability, these qualities actually enhanced his appeal to spiritual seekers, tired of artificiality and formality. His discourse consistently emphasized pure faith over ritual observance, sincere prayer over mechanical recitation, personal spiritual experience over theological doctrine, and rejection of religious conventions and hierarchies in favor of direct, unmediated access to the divine. Elements that captivated both religious figures seeking to revitalize orthodoxy and lay people, especially aristocratic women, who were hungry for authenticity, emotional connection, and spiritual meaning in lives that were often empty despite material luxury. Bishop Theophan's residence began hosting discreet gatherings where Rasputin led prayer sessions characterized by emotional intensity and spiritual fervor, quite unlike conventional church services, and offered personalized spiritual guidance to an increasingly distinguished clientele drawn from the highest levels of Petersburg society. Among the regular attendees were duchesses, countesses, wealthy merchants, wives, priests seeking spiritual renewal, and members of the Tsarist bureaucracy, many of whom reported profound experiences of ecstasy, divine revelation, emotional catharsis, or even miraculous healing after their encounters with the peasant mystic. These gatherings operated in a semi-private sphere, not quite public but not entirely secret, creating an air of exclusivity and mystery that enhanced their appeal. Rasputin's social ascent did not occur through normal institutional channels or formal recognition by established authorities, but rather through informal networks of personal connections, whispered recommendations, and testimonials that valued personal charisma, emotional impact, and apparent spiritual power above formal titles, academic credentials, theological training, or aristocratic lineage. Nevertheless, even as his reputation grew among devotees, Rasputin's presence made certain influential sectors of the church hierarchy increasingly uncomfortable. Conservative bishops and priests viewed his unorthodox style with justified suspicion and growing alarm, worried about his unclear past, his lack of formal theological training, his unconventional practices, and the intense emotional and possibly physical intimacy that seemed to characterize his relationships with female followers. Reports began circulating about potentially scandalous behavior, though at this early stage, they were largely dismissed or suppressed by his powerful patrons. The ecclesiastical establishment faced a dilemma. Rasputin was gaining followers and appeared to inspire genuine religious devotion, but he operated outside normal church control and supervision, making him both potentially valuable and potentially dangerous to institutional authority. The first documented contact between Rasputin and the imperial family occurred around 1905, carefully facilitated by influential clerics like Theophan and nobles such as Grand Duchess Militsa and her sister Grand Duchess Anastasia, members of the extended imperial family who were deeply interested in mysticism, spiritualism, and alternative religious practices. These aristocratic women actively cultivated relationships with various spiritual figures and were constantly seeking holy men who might possess genuine supernatural powers. Tsar Nicholas II and, especially, Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna were at this time experiencing a period of profound personal anguish that overshadowed all other concerns and dominated their emotional lives. Their youngest son and only male child, Alexei Nikolaevich, the long-awaited heir to the throne whose birth in 1904 had finally secured the Romanov succession after the births of 4 daughters, had been diagnosed with hemophilia, a hereditary disease that prevented proper blood clotting and rendered even minor injuries potentially fatal. This diagnosis was devastating on multiple levels, personally, politically, and dynastically. Hemophilia, which Alexei inherited through his mother's lineage descending from Queen Victoria of England, was incurable by the medicine of that era, which lacked the blood products and clotting factors that would later allow hemophiliacs to live relatively normal lives. Each new crisis the boy experienced, whether from a fall in a bump or spontaneous internal bleeding, represented a genuine threat not only to his young life, but to the entire succession of the imperial line, as he was the only male heir. The disease also had to be kept secret from the public and even from most of the court, as any sign of weakness in the heir might embolden political opposition, encourage foreign enemies, and undermine the mystique of imperial power that depended partly on the perception of the Tsar as chosen by God to rule. Alexandra was deeply, intensely religious, with strong ties to the Russian Orthodox tradition that she had embraced upon her conversion from her native German Lutheranism, and she possessed mystical beliefs that in some respects bordered on the superstitious, highly emotional, nervous by temperament, and increasingly isolated at court where she was viewed as foreign and cold. She desperately sought reassurance and help through spiritual means. Convinced absolutely of miracles and divine signs, interpreting events through a theological lens, she came to view her son's illness as a spiritual trial sent by God, a test of faith that required not just medical treatment, but divine intervention. She actively sought help from supernatural sources when conventional medicine proved powerless, consulting various healers, holy men, and mystics over the years, most of whom failed to provide any relief or comfort. When Rasputin was first invited to the palace to pray for the sick child, an invitation that came through the network of aristocratic patronesses who believed in his powers, he behaved with appropriate humility in the imperial presence, spoke little about himself, but prayed fervently and with evident emotional intensity beside the suffering boy. Whether through fortunate coincidence, psychological effect on both the anxious mother and the suffering child, some genuine but unexplained ability to calm and comfort, or actual supernatural intervention, as Alexandra believed, Alexei showed marked improvement shortly after these initial visits. The bleeding episodes subsided, the boy's pain decreased, and he was able to rest more peacefully. Changes that made an extraordinarily powerful and lasting impression on the desperate Tsarina who had been watching her son suffer helplessly. From that pivotal moment forward, Rasputin came to be considered an absolutely essential presence in the family's life, particularly during moments of medical crisis when the boy's life hung in the balance and the imperial succession itself was threatened. Alexandra became convinced that Alexei's survival depended directly on Rasputin's prayers and presence, a belief that would shape the remainder of her life and the fate of the dynasty. Rasputin's visits to the palace, which at first were discreet, infrequent, and carefully managed to avoid attracting attention, became increasingly frequent over time as the Tsarina's dependence on him grew. He maintained direct contact with Alexandra through an extensive correspondence of letters and telegrams in which he offered spiritual guidance, provided comfort and reassurance about Alexei's condition, gave advice about caring for the boy, and gradually began offering opinions on other matters, including political affairs and ministerial appointments. Some historians and medical experts have suggested that Rasputin possessed empirical knowledge about calming techniques, stress reduction, and emotional management that may have helped control the Tsarina's severe anxiety episodes, a critical factor in the child's well-being, since maternal stress and anxiety could trigger or worsen bleeding episodes through various psychosomatic mechanisms. The Tsarina's emotional state directly affected how she handled her son, and Rasputin's ability to calm her may have indirectly benefited Alexei by creating a more peaceful environment conducive to healing. On other occasions, according to numerous accounts from witnesses, Rasputin's mere presence in the sick room seemed to calm both the young boy and his distraught mother, powerfully reinforcing his image as a divine intercessor sent specifically by God to save the Romanov dynasty from extinction. Some sources suggest Rasputin may have advised against the overuse of aspirin, which was sometimes given to Alexei, and which, unknown to doctors at the time, acts as a blood thinner and would dangerously exacerbate his hemophilia. If this is true, then his miraculous healings may have had a medical basis, though this remains speculative. What is certain is that Alexei often improved when Rasputin was present or after receiving his prayers, and worsened when Rasputin was absent or banished from court, creating a correlation that Alexandra interpreted as proof of divine favor. By 1907, Rasputin had become virtually irreplaceable in Alexandra's mind and emotions, occupying a position of trust and intimacy that exceeded that of ministers, generals, or even family members. Even when faced with increasingly vocal criticism from court physicians who considered his influence dangerous, his methods questionable, and his presence inappropriate, the Tsarina insisted with fierce determination on keeping him close, dismissing all objections and viewing opposition to Rasputin as opposition to God's will and thus to the welfare of her son. Records from the Empress's own diary, which she kept sporadically, show constant repeated expressions of profound gratitude to Rasputin, whom she called our friend, the Holy Father, our dear one, and similar terms of affection and veneration that indicated the depth of her emotional and spiritual dependence. Tsar Nicholas II, more skeptical by nature and temperament, more rational in his approach to problems, and privately uncomfortable with the peasant mystic's growing presence and influence in his family's private life, nonetheless accepted the situation primarily out of deep loyalty to his beloved wife, whose happiness and peace of mind he valued above his own comfort, and because of the apparent beneficial effect that Rasputin seemed to have on his son, whose survival was paramount. Nicholas was a devoted family man, deeply in love with his wife despite her unpopularity at court, and he was willing to tolerate considerable discomfort and criticism to support her convictions and needs. This dynamic of the Tsar deferring to his wife's judgment regarding Rasputin, even against his own instincts and the advice of trusted counselors, would prove absolutely catastrophic for the monarchy, as it created a dependency that could not be broken, even as Rasputin's public reputation deteriorated dramatically, and his presence became a major political liability that undermined the regime's credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of both the elite and the masses. With the outbreak and subsequent advance of the First World War, which began in August 1914 and quickly turned into a catastrophic meat grinder consuming Russia's soldiers and resources, and especially after Tsar Nicholas II's fateful decision to depart for the front to assume direct personal command of the army in September 1915. A decision made against the advice of most of his ministers, who recognized that it would make him personally responsible for military defeats. Rasputin came to play an even more significant and ultimately destructive role within the palace, particularly through his intensifying relationship with Tsarina Alexandra. With the throne effectively weakened by the Tsar's prolonged absence at military headquarters in Mogilev, hundreds of miles from the capital, and with central authority dispersed across vast distances and competing power centers, the Empress assumed greater control over the empire's internal affairs than any Russian empress had wielded in generations, making critical decisions that would normally have required the Tsar's direct involvement and approval. During this extraordinarily critical period, as Russia faced military defeats, economic collapse, and growing social unrest, Rasputin became Alexandra's principal advisor, not only on spiritual and personal matters relating to her son's health, but increasingly and disastrously on affairs of state, ministerial appointments, military strategy, and even foreign policy questions that required sophisticated understanding of international relations and military logistics, areas in which an illiterate Siberian peasant had no expertise whatsoever. Rasputin began intervening directly and frequently in the appointment and dismissal of ministers, military officers, regional administrators, and other government officials, proposing allies or protégés for positions, suggesting replacements for officials he distrusted or who had offended him, and basing his recommendations on personal and spiritual criteria. Loyalty to himself and the Tsarina, perceived spiritual qualities, personal friendships, rather than competence, experience, administrative ability, or political wisdom. Documents from the era, including extensive surviving correspondence between Alexandra and Nicholas, demonstrate beyond question that she trusted Rasputin's counsel blindly and absolutely, often referring to him in letters as her only reliable guide in a world that she perceived as full of conspiracies, betrayals, and enemies seeking to harm her family. She would write things like "Our friend says," followed by advice about ministerial appointments or policy decisions, expecting her husband to follow these recommendations without question. In one particularly chaotic and destructive period between 1915 and 1916, as Russia's military situation deteriorated and domestic pressures mounted, Russia had 4 different prime ministers in just 17 months, an unprecedented political instability that paralyzed government operations, prevented coherent policy formation, and demoralized the bureaucracy. This ministerial leapfrogs, as contemporaries called it, was frequently and correctly attributed to the pernicious influence of the holy man and his mysterious hold over the empress, who had effectively become the power behind the throne in her husband's absence. Competent, experienced ministers who dared to question Rasputin's influence or who refused to consult with him found themselves dismissed and replaced by mediocrities, yes, men or individuals whose primary qualification was that Rasputin approved of them. Criticism of Rasputin was not limited to narrow political circles or government officials. The underground press, growing progressively bolder and more savage in the face of the regime's increasing fragility and decreasing ability to maintain effective censorship and control public opinion, published inflammatory pamphlets and brutal satirical caricatures that portrayed him as a manipulator, a charlatan, a debauched peasant who had somehow hypnotized the imperial family, and even as a German spy working to undermine Russia's war effort from within. One of the most explosive and damaging themes that was endlessly exploited was the nature of his physical proximity to the Empress, with dark insinuations of an intimate, possibly sexual relationship between the German-born Tsarina and the peasant mystic. An accusation that was almost certainly false, never proven despite intense scrutiny, but which had a devastating impact on public opinion, the monarchy's reputation, and the legitimacy of the entire Romanov dynasty in the eyes of both the elite and the masses who heard and believed these rumors. The very suggestion that the Empress might be under the sexual thrall of an uneducated peasant, that she might be betraying her husband the Tsar, or that policy decisions might be influenced by an illicit relationship, was absolutely explosive in a rigidly hierarchical society, obsessed with social propriety, sexual morality, and the mystique of imperial dignity. These rumors, whether believed literally or simply seen as symbolically representing the corruption and degradation of the regime, did incalculable damage to the monarchy's image and helped prepare the psychological ground for revolution by destroying respect for the imperial family. Within the palace walls, behind the scenes away from public view, Rasputin displayed increasingly ambiguous and troubling behavior that seemed to contradict his claims of holiness and spiritual authority. Although he continued to present himself publicly as a humble servant of God, a simple peasant called to serve the imperial family through his prayers, he was widely and accurately known to be a frequent patron of restaurants, nightclubs, and bathhouses, where he attended parties featuring abundant alcohol consumption, often drinking to excess and engaging in behavior that scandalized even the jaded aristocracy. The constant presence of women from the elite, aristocratic ladies and wealthy merchants' wives, in his intimate circle provided endless fodder for gossip and speculation. These women, often seeking spiritual guidance or healing for themselves or family members, spent considerable time alone with Rasputin in his apartment, attended his prayer sessions, and displayed what appeared to be disturbing emotional and possibly physical intimacy with him. Accusations of sexual impropriety multiplied, with claims that Rasputin used his spiritual authority to seduce female followers, that his prayer sessions sometimes devolved into sexual encounters, and that he taught a doctrine that sin, including sexual sin, could be a path to redemption through repentance, a potentially heretical idea that certainly would have been attractive to those seeking to justify transgressive behavior. Whether these accusations were entirely accurate, partially true, or largely fabricated by enemies, is difficult to determine from the historical record, which is contaminated by political motivations and sensationalism. What is clear is that Rasputin's personal behavior was scandalous, that he did not live according to the austere standards expected of a holy man, and that this hypocrisy undermined his spiritual authority even among some who had initially believed in him. In 1916, the Holy Synod, the governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, sent formal reports to the Tsar warning in increasingly urgent terms about the scandal surrounding Rasputin's figure, demanding action to remove him from influence, and expressing concern that his presence was damaging not just the imperial family's reputation, but the Church itself and the moral fabric of society. However, Nicholas II, trusting his wife's judgment above all else, prioritizing her emotional well-being and their son's health over political considerations, and perhaps also unwilling to confront the emotional crisis that removing Rasputin would trigger in Alexandra, minimized the complaints and took no meaningful action to address the growing crisis, believing or hoping that the controversy would somehow subside if ignored. Rasputin's notoriety among the Russian public grew in direct and accelerating proportion to the general discontent about his perceived presence at court and his real control over imperial policy during a time of national catastrophe. while some continued to regard him as a genuine saint with miraculous healing powers sent by God to preserve Russia. Believers who included not just the imperial family, but various aristocrats, peasants who had encountered him, and others who had experienced or witnessed what they interpreted as miracles. For many others throughout Russian society, he had become the living symbol, the human embodiment of the moral and political decay of the entire imperial system. The scandals bearing his name began multiplying dramatically from 1912 onward, accelerating as the war situation worsened and public frustration sought targets when specific allegations emerged about his private parties, excessive alcohol consumption, libertine conduct, and exploitation of his influence for personal gain. These notorious gatherings, held in expensive restaurants, in aristocratic homes, and in luxury apartments that believers provided for his use, were described in whispered rumors and published accounts as beginning with mystical meetings and prayer sessions that then devolved into drunken orgies involving Rasputin and multiple female followers. Though the exact veracity of such details remains subject to considerable historical debate and may reflect exaggeration, fabrication, or politically motivated slander, what seems certain is that Rasputin did attend parties where he drank heavily, that he did have intimate female followers who visited him privately, and that his behavior was sufficiently scandalous to provoke genuine outrage even among aristocrats who were hardly models of moral rectitude themselves. Various sectors of Russian society began viewing Rasputin as an existential threat to the empire's survival and to Russia's ability to successfully prosecute the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Military officers, particularly those from aristocratic families with traditions of service, accused him of interfering in strategic war decisions, of advocating for a separate peace with Germany that would betray Russia's allies, and even of potentially acting as a German agent or sympathizer, a charge that was almost certainly false, but which was widely believed, and which reflected the desperate search for explanations for Russia's military failures. Deputies in the Duma, the quasi-parliamentary body that had been granted limited powers after the 1905 revolution, demanded explanations about his informal power, called for his immediate removal from the capital, and delivered increasingly bold speeches denouncing the influence of dark forces surrounding the throne, barely coded references to Rasputin that everyone understood. Even the Orthodox clergy, which had initially tolerated him with some reservations and even provided crucial early support through figures like Bishop Theophan, began mobilizing against him with increasing determination, considering his practices a violation of proper doctrine, his influence a danger to the Church's authority and reputation, and his theology potentially heretical. In 1911, Bishop Hermogenes and Archdeacon Iliador, both former allies of Rasputin who had initially believed in his spiritual gifts, became his most fervent and vocal opponents after what they claimed was a falling out over theological issues and Rasputin's behavior. They publicly denounced his alleged heresies, accused him of teaching that sin could be a path to salvation, claimed he belonged to the Klisti sect, and described his moral abuses in terms that shocked even hardened political observers and contributed significantly to destroying his reputation among believers who had previously trusted him. The press, both legal publications operating under censorship and illegal underground pamphlets that circulated clandestinely, played an absolutely crucial role in constructing and disseminating Rasputin's public image as a villain, a national threat, and a symbol of everything wrong with the decaying Tsarist system. Although imperial censorship attempted to control the narrative through official channels, prohibiting publications from mentioning Rasputin by name or discussing the imperial family's private affairs, newspapers and clandestine pamphlets successfully evaded these restrictions through coded language, allegorical references, and simple disregard for the law, disseminating brutal caricatures showing Rasputin as a demon or monster, sensationalist accounts of his alleged sexual exploits and drunken behavior, and supposedly compromising dialogues that purported to reveal his influence over policy. One of the most explosive and politically damaging cases involved the publication and widespread circulation of private letters from Tsarina Alexandra addressed to Rasputin, personal correspondence written in a tone considered inappropriately intimate, emotionally charged, and suggesting a relationship that exceeded the bounds of propriety even if it was not actually sexual. While these letters, which were apparently stolen from Rasputin's apartment by agents or enemies and then released to damage the imperial family, did not actually prove a romantic or sexual relationship when read carefully, they nonetheless provided powerful fuel for rumors of adultery and corruption that spread like wildfire through Russian society, being read, discussed, and interpreted in the most damaging possible ways. The political opposition, ranging from moderate liberals to revolutionary socialists, expertly exploited this reputational damage to accuse the government of allowing an uneducated peasant mystic to direct the nation's destiny during the midst of a catastrophic war that was killing millions of Russian soldiers, devastating the economy, and threatening the empire's very survival. Rasputin became a perfect target, a lightning rod for all the accumulated frustrations, resentments, and grievances that Russians felt toward a system that seemed incapable of reform or effective action. The escalation of scandals and mounting political pressure from multiple directions led to numerous attempts, both formal and informal, by various individuals and factions to neutralize Rasputin's influence and remove him from proximity to the imperial family. Between 1911 and 1914, sectors of the government, including some ministers, leaders of the Orthodox Church hierarchy, and members of the Duma, proposed repeatedly to the Tsar that Rasputin be sent to a monastery, preferably a remote one in Siberia or in northern Russia far from the capital, as a means of preserving the monarchy's image and credibility while still allowing him to live and pray. This solution would have removed him from direct influence while avoiding the scandal of outright persecution of a figure whom many still considered holy. However, Alexandra always opposed such measures with tremendous energy and emotional intensity, utterly convinced that her son's health and very life depended directly and immediately on the presence of the holy man, and that removing him would result in Alexei's death and thus the extinction of the dynasty. Her opposition was absolute and non-negotiable, and the Tsar would not act against her wishes on this matter. In 1914, Rasputin survived a dramatic assassination attempt that would further enhance his mystical aura as a figure apparently immune to ordinary dangers and protected by supernatural forces. On June 29th, in his native village of Pokrovskoye, where he had returned for a visit, a woman identified as Kionia Guseva, a former follower of the dissident priest Iliodor who had turned against Rasputin, approached him on a village street and suddenly attacked him with a knife, screaming that she was killing the Antichrist. The stab wound penetrated deep into his abdomen, severing intestines and causing massive blood loss that would have killed most people within minutes. Local doctors who were summoned doubted he would survive the injury given the severity of the trauma. The inevitable infection in an era before antibiotics, and the primitive medical facilities available in a small Siberian village. However, demonstrating either remarkable physical resilience, supernatural intervention as believers claimed, or simply good fortune, Rasputin resisted both the initial trauma and the subsequent complications of infection and internal bleeding, spending weeks hovering between life and death, in what witnesses described as an almost supernatural struggle in which his will to live seemed to overcome medical odds. His recovery, though slow, excruciating, and leaving him with permanent physical damage and chronic pain, was ultimately complete enough that he was able to return to the court and resume his activities, arriving with a renewed discourse of divine mission, claiming that God had preserved his life for a purpose and projecting an image of indestructibility that impressed even skeptics. This survival significantly strengthened not only his public image as a miracle worker protected by God, but also his psychological and emotional control over the Tsarina, who came to consider him absolutely irreplaceable, divinely protected, and essential to her family's survival. Alexandra interpreted his survival as proof that God wanted him to continue his mission of protecting Alexei and guiding the imperial family. Letters from Alexandra to Nicholas during this period expressed constant, almost obsessive fear that new attacks might take Rasputin away from her side, leading to increased security measures around him, greater secrecy surrounding his movements and activities, and even more complete dependence on his guidance and presence. Simultaneously, however, Rasputin's return to public life and to the court reignited the opposition with renewed fury and determination. Groups of military officers, conservative nobles worried about the monarchy's survival, and political figures across the spectrum began planning more effective, more permanent ways to remove him from power, moving beyond attempted exile or spiritual remediation toward the ultimate solution of assassination. The conspiracy to assassinate Rasputin developed gradually throughout 1916, driven by an informal coalition of nobles, politicians, and military officers who genuinely viewed his elimination as the last possible opportunity to save the monarchy from complete collapse, revolution, and the destruction of the social order that gave them their privileged positions. The most elaborate and ultimately successful plan was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's wealthiest families, owner of magnificent palaces, a man of considerable charm, education, and sophistication who had traveled widely in Europe, and by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a direct relative of the Tsar himself and someone close to the imperial family. Also participating was Vladimir Purishkevich, a military physician serving at the front and an influential member of the Duma, known for his passionate, fiery speeches and his extreme nationalist, monarchist views. These men represented different sectors of the elite, ancient aristocracy, the imperial family itself, and the emerging political class, united in desperation. The conspirators genuinely, sincerely believed that Rasputin's death would break the spell or psychological hold he supposedly maintained over the Tsarina, that Alexandra would wake up from her delusion once he was gone, and that this would allow for internal reorganization of the government, replacement of incompetent ministers, restoration of the monarchy's credibility, and successful prosecution of the war before the situation spiraled completely beyond control into revolution. They saw themselves not as traitors or murderers, but as patriots performing a necessary, even heroic act to save Russia from catastrophe. This self-justification would prove tragically misguided, as Rasputin's death solved nothing and may have actually accelerated the revolutionary crisis by removing the one scapegoat on whom public anger had been focused. On the night of December 29-30, 1916, December 16-17 according to the Julian calendar, then still in use in Russia, Rasputin was lured to Yusupov's magnificent palace on the Moika Canal in central Petrograd. The capital had been renamed from the German-sounding St. Petersburg during the war, under the careful pretext of meeting the prince's beautiful wife, Princess Irina, who was reportedly interested in meeting the famous holy man and possibly seeking his spiritual guidance. Rasputin, despite reported warnings from friends and even his own daughter that something was wrong, that he was in danger, accepted the invitation, perhaps from overconfidence, perhaps from curiosity, or perhaps from a fatalistic sense that his death was approaching and was God's will. Upon arrival at the palace late at night, he was led to a basement room that had been specially prepared for the occasion, furnished comfortably with refreshments and designed to put him at ease while the conspirators waited upstairs, nervous and armed. There, Yusupov offered him cakes and wine that had been supposedly laced with massive doses of potassium cyanide poison, enough, according to later accounts, to kill several men almost instantly. To the conspirators, profound astonishment, growing panic and complete bewilderment, Rasputin displayed what seemed like impossible resistance to the poison. He ate multiple poisoned cakes, drank poisoned wine, and continued chatting amiably without presenting any of the expected symptoms of cyanide poisoning such as convulsions, difficulty breathing, or loss of consciousness. He simply continued eating, drinking, and talking, seemingly completely unaffected, which terrified the watching conspirators who began to believe the rumors about his supernatural powers. Modern analysis has suggested several possible explanations for this apparent miracle. The cyanide may have been neutralized by the sugar in the cakes or by the wine. The poison may have degraded and lost potency, or it may simply have been administered in improper form. Faced with the failure of this initial attempt and fearful that dawn would arrive before they completed their task, potentially exposing the plot, Yusupov took a revolver and shot Rasputin at close range in the chest, a wound that appeared to kill him immediately as he collapsed to the floor bleeding profusely. The conspirators gathered around the body, believing the deed was done, but incredibly, after a few minutes, Rasputin suddenly opened his eyes, rose to his feet despite the gunshot wound, and attacked Yusupov in a desperate attempt to escape, or perhaps to exact revenge, demonstrating a physical resilience that seemed to confirm supernatural powers. Rasputin managed to break free and began fleeing through the palace and out into the snow-covered courtyard, stumbling and crawling toward the gate, screaming for help, leaving a trail of blood in the snow, a horrifying scene that the witnesses would never forget. This prompted Perishkovich to fire multiple additional shots at the fleeing, wounded man, at least one of which struck him in the back. Even after this series of gunshots that would certainly have killed any normal person, the conspirators remained uncertain whether Rasputin was truly dead, so fearful were they of his reputed powers. They beat his body with clubs and heavy objects, and according to some accounts, one conspirator even attempted to castrate him, though this detail may be apocryphal. Finally, after conclusively establishing that no signs of life remained, the conspirators wrapped his body in heavy cloth, bound it with ropes, weighed it down, and threw it through a hole in the ice of the frozen Neva River, still fearing that he might somehow revive even from the apparent death they had inflicted. Days later, when the body was recovered by police investigators, it showed signs of a desperate struggle, bore multiple gunshot wounds, had evidence of severe beating, and most significantly, contained water in the lungs, a medical finding strongly suggesting he was still breathing, still alive, when thrown into the freezing water, and that his actual cause of death was drowning or hypothermia rather than the poison or bullets. This horrifying detail, that he survived poison, multiple gunshots, and beating only to die slowly in the icy water, would fuel legends about his supernatural resilience and seeming indestructibility for generations to come. The brutality and the mystery surrounding the crime generated both fascination and horror throughout Russian society and internationally. The conspirators did not deny their participation. On the contrary, they openly acknowledged and even boasted about the killing, expecting to be acclaimed as saviors of the empire, as patriots who had eliminated a dangerous enemy, an expectation that proved profoundly mistaken, tragically naive, and demonstrated how disconnected even well-meaning members of the elite had become from political reality. While some segments of society did celebrate Rasputin's death, the imperial family was devastated. The Tsarina became even more isolated and distrustful, and the general public increasingly viewed the entire imperial system, including both Rasputin and his killers, with contempt. News of Rasputin's violent death spread rapidly through Petrograd and then throughout the empire, received with relief, celebration, or grim satisfaction by much of the aristocracy and conservative sectors who had viewed him as the embodiment of everything wrong with the regime, the source of its corruption and incompetence. However, contrary to the conspirators' fervent expectations and hopes, his elimination brought neither political pacification nor rehabilitation of the imperial family's badly damaged image and destroyed credibility. Instead, the empire's internal situation deteriorated with alarming speed, accelerating toward complete collapse. The urban population, exhausted by 3 years of catastrophic war, severe food shortages, inflation that destroyed savings, incompetent leadership, and hundreds of thousands of casualties, no longer distinguished between Rasputin and Tsarism itself. Both represented a distant, indifferent, incompetent system that had lost all legitimacy and deserved to be swept away. In the weeks following the assassination, popular pressure against the monarchy reached unprecedented levels of intensity and anger. The Duma, now divided between moderate liberals seeking constitutional monarchy and radical socialists demanding complete systemic change and transfer of power to the people, demanded urgent structural reforms, including the formation of a government responsible to parliament rather than to the Tsar's arbitrary will, guarantees of civil liberties, and a complete reorganization of the war effort under competent leadership. Nicholas II, inflexible, stubborn, and still under Alexandra's powerful emotional and psychological influence, even after Rasputin's death, refused to yield meaningful ground or compromise with the opposition, remaining convinced that imperial authority was sacred, granted by God, and non-negotiable regardless of circumstances or practical necessity. He believed that any concession would be interpreted as weakness and would only encourage further demands until the monarchy was destroyed. The Tsarina, emotionally devastated by the loss of Rasputin, whom she mourned intensely, convinced his death marked the beginning of her family's doom and was a sign that God had abandoned them, withdrew even further from reality and from engagement with the political crisis, increasing her distrust of everyone around her. Viewing all as potential enemies and conspirators, alienating potential allies who might have helped save the dynasty, and eliminating any remaining possibility of political reconciliation or reform that might have allowed the monarchy to survive in modified form. She reportedly told intimates that Russia was lost without Rasputin's prayers and guidance, that dark forces had triumphed, and that catastrophe was inevitable. On the war front, the Russian army existed in a state of advanced moral and organizational collapse. Desertions increased daily as soldiers abandoned their posts by the thousands, and sometimes entire units refused orders, and many returned to their native cities and villages, carrying tales of incompetence, corruption, hunger, abandonment by officers and government, and senseless slaughter in battles that accomplished nothing. Rasputin's figure, even after his death, continued to be invoked constantly as a symbol of corruption and destructive influence over the throne, as evidence that the imperial system was rotten to its core. Revolutionary pamphlets distributed in factories and barracks used his image prominently to denounce what they called the spiritual and moral rot of the Romanov regime, arguing that his career demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of the old order, proving that the aristocracy was decadent and incompetent, and showing that the monarchy could not be reformed but must be completely destroyed. In February 1917, less than 2 months after Rasputin's assassination, barely enough time for the political situation to stabilize if stabilization had been possible, a massive revolt of workers and soldiers erupted in Petrograd, beginning with strikes and bread riots and quickly escalating into armed insurrection when military units sent to suppress the demonstrations instead joined them. The revolution culminated in the monarchy's complete fall, the collapse of the entire imperial system that had ruled Russia for centuries. Nicholas II's abdication was announced on March 15th, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov dynasty rule and permanently altering the course not just of Russian history, but of world history, as the revolution would eventually bring the Bolsheviks to power and create the Soviet Union. The revolutionaries generally viewed Rasputin's death as part of a necessary purification process, as the removal of one particularly corrupt element of a corrupt system, but one that was clearly insufficient to save an order that was rotten throughout and whose time had passed. The imperial family's fate would be even more tragic. After months of house arrest, they were eventually moved to Siberia, then to the Ural Mountains town of Yekaterinburg, and finally, in July 1918, executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries who feared they might be rescued by anti-communist forces and become symbols of restoration. Rasputin, in death, could not save the family he had claimed to protect, and indeed his influence may have hastened their doom by undermining their legitimacy and alienating potential supporters. Rasputin's violent death did not end his influence or presence in Russian and world consciousness. Rather, it initiated and accelerated the construction of one of the 20th century's most enduring, persistent myths that continues growing even today. From the earliest accounts of his execution, which began circulating within days, contradictory versions emerged and multiplied, each more fantastic, exaggerated, and dramatic than the last. His supposed resistance to massive doses of poison, bullets that apparently failed to kill him immediately, his attempt to escape despite mortal wounds, and the presence of water in his lungs discovered during autopsy served as the foundation for a narrative with supernatural overtones that captured imaginations worldwide. The idea that Rasputin possessed occult powers, that he was protected by dark forces, or alternatively that he had been sent by God and thus could not be killed by ordinary means, gained tremendous force in foreign press coverage and sensationalist literature, transforming him from a merely historical figure into an almost mythological character, comparable to vampires, sorcerers, or demons from folklore. During the Soviet regime that came to power after the 1917 revolution, Rasputin's figure was repeatedly reinterpreted and manipulated according to the ideological needs of different periods and political circumstances. Initially, during the early years of communist rule, Rasputin was utilized extensively as a prime example of the inevitable consequences of alliance between the church, aristocracy, and obscurantism, as proof that the old order was hopelessly corrupt and deserved to be violently overthrown. State-promoted and censored films, theatrical productions, and books portrayed him consistently as a manipulator, a sexual deviant, a drunkard, and the ultimate symbol of Tsarist decadence, using him as a convenient villain whose evil helped justify the revolution and the destruction of the old order. Yet selective censorship and narrative framing preserved the ambiguous character of his role, as it also served the Soviet regime's interests to show how he had deceived and manipulated the nobility, exposing their fundamental weakness, stupidity, and moral bankruptcy. The destruction of Rasputin's body in 1917 by Bolshevik authorities, who dug up his corpse from the imperial family's private burial ground and burned it, was intended to erase his memory and prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for monarchist sympathizers or religious believers. But the effect proved opposite to what was intended. It consolidated his image as an accursed and eternal figure whose influence and presence could not be eliminated even through physical annihilation, and whose spirit or memory continued to haunt Russia. The refusal to allow him a permanent grave added to his mystique, suggesting something supernatural or uncanny about him that required such extreme measures. Outside Russia, particularly throughout the Western world, Rasputin became a recurring, almost obsessive theme in popular culture, appearing far more frequently in films, books, and other media than most historical figures of comparable importance. Since the 1920s, his dramatic life inspired numerous films, including the famous 1932 Hollywood production Rasputin and the Empress, starring Lionel Barrymore in the title role, plus dozens of fictional versions in European and American cinema that took increasing liberties with historical accuracy. These films typically portrayed him as either a sinister villain with hypnotic powers or as a tragic figure caught in forces beyond his control, depending on the political and artistic orientation of the filmmakers. In the 1970s, the disco group Boney M immortalized his name for a new generation with their hit song Rasputin, which described him memorably as Russia's greatest love machine and presented him as a fatal mystic with sexual charisma and supernatural powers, a characterization that, while historically dubious and based more on legend than fact, captured popular imagination brilliantly and introduced his story to millions who might otherwise never have heard of him. The song's catchy melody and dramatic narrative ensured that Rasputin's name and legend would continue to circulate in popular consciousness. His image has appeared in countless books, documentaries, artistic works, video games, and internet memes, ensuring his legend continues growing and evolving rather than fading with time, as happens with most historical figures. The enduring fascination with Rasputin reflects several factors. The inherently dramatic nature of his story, with its elements of mystery, sex, violence, and political intrigue. The symbolism of his rise as a story about how charismatic individuals can exploit faith and fear to achieve power far beyond what their origins would suggest possible, and perhaps most importantly, the way his career illuminates timeless questions about the nature of influence, the psychology of manipulation, and the dangers of blind faith in charismatic leaders. Was Rasputin merely a convenient scapegoat, cynically used by various parties to justify the Tsarist regime's inevitable ruin? Or did he genuinely manipulate the strings of the Russian Empire with considerable skill, accelerating its catastrophic fall through his influence over policy and his role in alienating the imperial family from society? The line between myth and historical reality remains extraordinarily thin, contested, and probably impossible to definitively establish given the contamination of sources by political motives and the loss of crucial evidence. But the question continues, provoking passionate debate among professional historians and the general public alike, with new biographies and studies appearing regularly that attempt to separate fact from fiction. What is your informed opinion based on this evidence? Was Rasputin fundamentally a genuine holy man with real spiritual gifts who became trapped in political forces beyond his understanding, an elaborate charlatan consciously exploiting desperate believers for personal gain and power? Or simply an instrument of historical circumstances who became something far greater than he ever intended or imagined? History reminds us powerfully that charismatic individuals can achieve extraordinary influence when established institutions weaken and lose credibility, when people desperately seek meaning and reassurance in times of chaos and crisis, when normal social barriers break down. A lesson that remains urgently relevant in our contemporary world, where similar figures continue emerging across the political and religious spectrum to exploit faith, fear, and uncertainty for personal gain, political purposes, or ideological goals. Understanding Rasputin means understanding something essential about human psychology, about the nature of power, and about the eternal dangers of allowing charisma to substitute for competence, faith to replace reason, and personal loyalty to override institutional norms and checks on authority.